Okay, well, it's 11 o'clock. A couple more people have joined us, so welcome, and I'm sure we'll continue welcoming more people. So we have these three papers in this session, and we will, I think we'll try to stick with the time, even though most sessions have 4. We only have 3, but just in case people are coming in to see a particular paper, we'll try to keep the same timing. So we'll have the 15-minute talks, and I will send you alerts about the time at 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 30 seconds before the finishing up. And then we have a 5-minute time for discussion and questions. If there's not time for all the questions, that's fine, because we have all this extra time at the end since we only have three talks and not 4. So we'll have lots of opportunities for discussion. And as a reminder, all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas, employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily the Fundação's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on the Fundação's official channels. Okay, great. So I'm just admitting 3 more people, and I believe we start then with Carlos.
Great. Let me share my screen. Okay, I think you yes, can now see my. Great. So thank you so much for having our research. Thank you to the organizers. Very nice conference. Our paper is about peer effect crime, and we try to articulate a little bit parental effort and how parents can buffer negative peer effects related to crime. This is a paper together with Eleonora Patacchini from Cornell. And as I said before, that's the main idea of the paper. Try to understand if there are anything parents can do in terms of decreasing the willingness of children to conform to peer pressure to engage in criminal activity. There are some literature that try to analyze how parents can deal with the fact that kids, especially adolescents, that we will see in this paper, select their friends, but it's hard, right? I mean, sometimes you as a parent need to take friends as given. And the paper tried to explore, is there anything you can do to help your kids, in this case, help them to deal with these negative peer effects. And in particular, maybe this also related to the neighborhood that we are going to see here. And in some cases, families cannot move, cannot leave the neighborhood to a better one. That's why we think the study that we present here is challenging. I mean, as we will discuss later, but I think that it is interesting. The paper is closely related to the cultural transmission literature. We present a very basic, simple model of cultural transmission. Juvenile crime is the outcome of a socialization process that takes place within the family and outside the family. Parents are thought as altruistic agents, that they try to minimize the level of crime committed by offspring. The main innovation of the paper is, among other things, parents can affect taste for conformity. You will see that in the model. And of course, the more a parent is involved in the offspring life, the lower it is utility experienced by her young agent when deviating, when departing. Of course, this is, I mean, our reference is the seminal work by Vicine and Bardier. We have some difference to that paper. We can discuss it later if you're not familiar, but I want to present it this 15 minutes, but I will be open to questions to clarify anything. So parents are going to affect how society influences their children's decision. This is different from the baseline model when in that model, socialization takes place at the household level. And if that doesn't happen, if not successful, then the kid is going to be socialized by the society. Peer effects are coming through friends rather than population averages. And in this case, we are going to model the transmission of traits that we can say that are vertically differentiated. So I think we agree that less crime is better, but that's not always the case. Think about religion. I mean, we can have different religions. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other, because we have different preferences. Then we are going to take advantage of AdHealth data set and try to test if our prediction makes sense when we compare the model to what happened to adolescents in the US. So the main question is, can parental involvement affect crime-related peer effect during offspring adolescence? That's it. Let's go to the theory. So as I said before, this is a simple model. We're going to have two periods and we're going to have two agents, one of them in each period. So we are going to have an old agent, the parent, and a young agent, the offspring, and one old agent is going to be matched with one young agent. In the first period, all agents are going to decide the optimal level of parental investment or parental involvement, or how you want. We're going to discuss this later. It's going to be captured by sigma. And then young agents are going to decide how much effort to exert in terms of criminal activity that's going to be represented by E. And they are going to incorporate sigma when they make their optimal choice. So we start with the second period. We're going to start by the offspring optimization problem. Notice that this is the utility function, the payoff, and this is a function of her own level of crime and the average crime in her group. The equation is pretty standard in terms of both prime. This is like Becker style utility function. So you have productivity, of course, a function of your own effort. Then you are going to have potential costs related to the probability of being caught, and then the fine you should pay. Of course, a function of E as well. This is a deterrence component. Then you are going to have E, A's effort, so effort is costly. And then this is the most interesting part in our case. And this component is the one that relates her own effort and the effort from the group. And as you notice, if you deviate from the norm, then that's going to be costly. Parents are going to be able to affect D. D is a function of sigma. And we are going to assume that the higher is sigma, the higher is the parental involvement, the lower is D, meaning that the lower is the disutility that the adolescent is going to experience from deviating relative to the group norm. So we solve the problem, and we have to think that are interesting. First of all, the optimal level of crime is decreasing in parental effort, and if we assume the level of crime in the group constant, the impact of the group is going to be decreasing in terms of sigma or relative to sigma. If we go to the parent problem, we have very simple, as I said before, setup. The utility function is a function of parental effort, and the only goal of this parent is to minimize her children's criminal activity. So, and that's going to be costly, right? So we have a convex cost function here that is a function of sigma, and we can represent the problem as follows, and we can solve, of course, the first order condition to get this relation here. The idea is that we can represent the functional form. Our most important function is the paper is this one that represent the interplay between what happens in the household, what happens with the friends in terms of crime. And if we make some assumption, we get this functional form. And if we get the functional form, we can get this equation here. And this is the equation that we are going to bring to the data. As you notice, we have an interaction term. Okay, so the setup that we use, of course, is going to be convenience in terms of the empirical application. But we think that it makes sense in terms of the theory too. So this is what we are going to test in the paper, in the empirical part of the paper. So this is a more detailed expression. It's not really a structural estimation, but it's an equation that is coming from the theory. These are the interaction term that we have. We have two parameters here, rho and gamma. We expect rho to be positive and gamma to be negative. So the higher is sigma, the lower is the marginal effect. And then we are going to incorporate characteristics of individuals and characteristics of the group as control. We are going to have a deterrent component that we said before in the basic Becker setup that inspired our utility function. And then of course we are going to have a noise. We use that health. We focus on the first two waves. For those that are not familiar with this survey, it's a really complete survey. We are going to talk about in a second about that. It focuses on different waves starting in the mid-90s. It's representative for adolescents in the US in high schools. And the good thing about this data set, and that's why it's well used when we try to test peer effects with data, is that we have we can construct the social contacts, but also we can exploit some questions that are related to very sensitive topics and that are really hard to find, for instance, crime. Okay, so we can have at the same time a network or at least peer effects, and at the same time we can also have crime. We can have a rich set of variables related to socioeconomic characteristics, attitude, preference, etc. We are going to have a spatial dimension. We're going to exploit that in the empirical strategy. And then we have a relatively large sample size, which is also important. Well, I said before, we have crime data. The kids are asked some questions related to their criminal activity. We are going to have 4 categories: theft, vandalism, drug trafficking, and violent crime. And then we are going to compile these 4 categories in one main category for total crime. So these are the categories related to the different questions in the survey. But the problem with this is not related to how we measure crime, which is always challenging. It's related to the empirical strategy. First, we are dealing with a network, and we have self-selection in networks. And if we have self-selection, we have problems related to how to identify peer effects. So in order to deal with that, what we try to do is to exploit the spatial location of the different homes. And we use that as a weight in our adjacency matrix. So to be more specific, we're going to use the Euclidean distance between an individual and her friends. And we're going to use the inverse of that, assuming that the closer you are, the higher the weight, because you're going to have more opportunities to interact with your peer. Of course, we now have other options that are not real virtual options for interaction, but still it's true now, but also recall that this is for the mid-90s, where we had less resources. So we are going to, when we compute the average level of crime in the group, we're going to use these weights. This is the distribution of the Díaz by distance. So for you to have an idea, the median distance between 2 homes is 2.2 miles. So we're going to assume that kids are not able to select where they live and where their friends live. The other problem that we have are correlated effects. So they are going to share one thing that is important. The reference group are kids in the same group, in the same grade, sorry, in the same school. So they are exposed to the same environment. So we have to deal with that. To deal with that, we do something that is pretty standard, is to incorporate peer effects, fixed effects. And as you will notice, in this balance test, when we regress the individual characteristics to the average level of crime in the group, without peer effect and without network fixed effect and with network fixed effect, we observe that the individual effect for each of these traits disappear. It's set for urban, but I think it's a pretty good result. We can have even by chance that. So network fixed effects seem to work. Crucial thing in our estimation is parental involvement. First, how to measure that, and then the potential endogeneity related to that measure. So sigma is going to be, the proxy for sigma is going to be a specific question that we have in the survey. When you do something wrong that is important, your mother talks about it. I have 2 minutes, so I will go a little bit faster. So your mother talk about it and help with you and help you understand why that is wrong. Unfortunately, we have only this for mothers, not for parents, for fathers too, but that's going to be our proxy. And this is the distribution. Let me go straight to the, one important thing that we do here. We do 2 things in order to deal with endogeneity of this, independent variable. The first thing is that we're going to exploit the longitudinal dimension of bad health, and we're going to use everything from wave 2 except parental involvement that is coming from wave 1. We're going to do an extra thing in the estimation to see if this is robust. Here are the results. This is rho and this is gamma. The sign are opposite, and the magnitudes seem to represent a relatively important impact in terms of parental effort and preference for conformity in terms of crime. So I have only 30 seconds. Let me wrap up. So I use my time as I was expected. The results are consistent when we look at the different specific type of crime that we have, as I said before. So more parental effort means less peer effects. And the other thing that we do is try to put more structure in the model to try to deal with this endogeneity. So we solve the model with this specific functional form for C, the cost of exerting parental effort, and we get this specific function. This is a quadratic spatial autoregressive model. So the parental involvement variable is not needed anymore, if this is true, of course, but this is just a robustness check. The results are still consistent with what we expect from the theory. So I think I don't have more time, but that's it. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm open for questions and discussion. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. I have a few slides for the discussion. So, okay, you can see the discussion slide. Great. Okay, so Carlos had a really nice paper in which they model adolescent crime with influences from peers, which they call the horizontal influences, but this horizontal influence can be dampened by parental involvement, the vertical integration. And they find that the influence of peers with more engaged mothers is not as strong as the adolescents whose mothers are more engaged. So parents can interrupt this peer influence. They find that the influence on drug trafficking and violent crime has the most potential to be influenced by parents in contrast to the other categories of vandalism and theft. So I really enjoyed some parts of Carlos's paper. I really enjoyed most of Carlos's paper, all of Carlos's paper. First, it's a very important topic. I am a parent myself, so this is like very relevant to think of how I can be involved in my high schooler's life to help them avoid crime. It's also, the model's very detailed. I really enjoyed reading the model. I don't do much modeling myself, but it was very clear, and I like the backward induction approach. The data is great. It's a huge sample, and I think they did a great job of using all types of aspects that the data offers. So they really got a lot out of the data. They use the geographical information for the peer effects, and the youth self-report about crime is great because you aren't missing the students who engage in crime but are not arrested. And then the panel data, they use the parental involvement from T-1 so that their analysis is more exogenous than if it had not been panel data. So I think this is a great choice of data to apply for this to this model. And then they did a robustness check that it was robust to a structural specification, and I really enjoyed all the appendices as well, which provided such a rich, detailed background to the main results. A few suggestions. I thought the parenting variable might be explored further. So thinking about parenting these days is more better. After some point, helicopter parenting these days gets a bad rap. So I thought perhaps you might consider looking at a parabolic structure. Also, the parenting literature doesn't always just have one dimension, but also multiple dimensions. So there's like 4 standard types of parenting, but I'm sure you could develop others out there. So just thinking about if additional dimensions you might want to explore those. And finally, in the paper, you decided not to do the quantity analysis, but I thought this could be a really interesting trade-off for parents to think about. Like if you contrasted the quantity versus quality, since quantity would take time away from the peers, that might also be a method of influence. You could also consider other risky behaviors. I know this has been done where parents have been shown to be influencing the other risky behaviors, so that might be too much for the paper, but it could just confirm that your results are consistent with others in the literature. And finally, to make the paper even more GeFam, I thought it'd be really interesting to look at your results by family structure. So particularly for single parent families, since these children are thought to be more vulnerable, is parental involvement in these single parent families more important in some way than 2-parent families, and especially for boys who might be, maybe the mother's involvement is less or more important in these single parent families. So Carlos, thanks for a great paper, and I look forward to seeing where it goes next.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yes, you want to take a minute to respond?
I really like, your suggestions, especially everything, but especially this last related to heterogeneity. I think this is a point that we should work more on it because it's like a natural question that the reader asks, right? I mean, what happens if we have like a single parent? What happens with boys and girls? Thank you so much.
Great. Does anyone else have a quick question for Carlos before we move on to Laura's paper? Okay, Laura, why don't you go ahead and we'll have more time to discuss at the end.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Laura Barros and I'm a PhD student at the University of Göttingen. And today I'm going to present a paper that is joint work with Yuanwei on the effect of natural disasters on intimate partner violence. So weather shocks and large-scale natural disasters, they have major economic and social consequences. The literature has documented that following these disasters, there can be an increase in conflict, political instability, political change, and crime. However, despite of these general effects of these large-scale disasters for the entire society, some authors, they have argued that the disasters can exacerbate pre-existing inequalities and social vulnerabilities, and therefore they might be more harmful for certain groups. So in this paper, what we are going to do is to look at how large-scale disasters affect violence against women. So just to give you an overview on this paper, the main research question we want to understand is whether the occurrence of an earthquake increases women's vulnerability to IPV. And we are interested not only in estimating some average effects, but also understanding what are the important heterogeneities and potential risk factors that can increase this vulnerability. So our identification strategy is pretty straightforward. So we are relying on the exogenous nature of the shock and exploiting the spatial and temporal distribution of these earthquakes and the geographic location of the households. So just to give you a preview of the results, what we find is that exposure to earthquakes increase the incidence of IPV. And in terms of heterogeneities, what we find is that the effect is less pronounced for women that are employed at the time of the shock, for households that have less conservative gender norms, and for households in districts with protective institutions. And in terms of males' violent behavior, we find that alcohol consumption can be an important risk factor. So I won't have time to go in detail in the literature, but basically we are here in this paper connecting to two main strands of papers. So first, the literature that looks at the socioeconomic effects of weather shocks and natural disasters, and specifically the literature that looks at the gender effects, and the literature on the determinants of violence against women. So there are a large number of papers that look both theoretically and empirically on the role of economic factors, psychological factors, but also institutional aspects in determining violence against women. And our contribution is therefore to link these two strands of the literature by emphasizing this temporal dynamics. So we would like to understand how these effects evolve over time, which might also have important policy implications. And we, as I mentioned, want to disentangle the role of these internal and external risk factors that can explain this vulnerability. So just to give you a background for this paper, we are focusing here on Peru, which is a country that is located in the so-called Ring of Fire at the border of the Nazca and the South American tectonic plates. So Peru is located over here, and we can see in blue the border of the tectonic plates. And what it means is that the country is very much prone to major seismic activity and volcanic eruptions. And despite being this geographically vulnerable location, the country still lacks in terms of disaster preparedness and response. Additionally, Peru has very large incidence of violence against women, even compared to other Latin American countries. And some authors have argued that this large incidence of violence relates to the very rigid gender roles and to the strong norms of masculinity that prevail in the country. So coming to the data sets that we use in this paper, to measure violence against women, we are going to rely on two different data sets. First, we have data from the demographic and health surveys. So we rely on three waves, so the DHS 2000, the continuous DHS 2004-2006, and the continuous DHS 2007-2008. And also, besides having this individual level information, we also have administrative records that come from the Peruvian Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Populations that record the number of registered cases of domestic violence at the state level. So we have also this aggregate measure. So to measure the earthquakes, we have shake maps of all significant earthquakes that happen in Peru. And this comes from the United States Geological Survey. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the shake maps and how they measure this spread of the earthquake throughout the territory. In our study period, there were three large earthquakes that happened in Peru, one in 2001, one in 2005, and one in 2007. And lastly, we also have information on the location of protective institutions in Peru. So these are the so-called women justice centers. So here you can see one picture of a women justice center. So this is not a police station itself, but it's a center that provides psychological and legal support to victims of violence. And we have the information on whether these institutions are available or not, which we also use for heterogeneity analysis. So here is how our data looks visually. these blue dots, they show the centroids of the DHS clusters, and this colorful polygons show where the earthquakes hit. So these are based on this information from the shake maps. And what you can see is that these yellow polygons, they show the earthquakes that are between 6 and 7 in the MMI scale, which is the modified Mercalli intensity scale. And the orange polygons, they show the earthquakes above 7.0. So just to clarify what this means, we are focusing here on earthquakes that have strong or above potential of destruction. So they are felt very strongly at the surface and they have high potential of destruction. So we are relying on the literature here and focusing on these strong earthquakes. And this is just to show you the timeline of our data. So we have, as I mentioned, 3 waves of the DHS, and we have the 3 earthquakes that happen in between. So in a sense, we have the DHS 2000 as a baseline. So there was no earthquake that happened just before this wave. And then we are going to, in a sense, try to investigate if the regions that were more severely affected by the earthquake, if they registered higher cases of violence, or if the respondent reports that she experienced violence. So coming to the regression model, as I mentioned, the outcome variable, IPV, is a binary measure that measures if the respondent ever experienced some form of IPV. So W denotes women, DHS cluster C, in district D is state S, and year T. And our main explanatory variable of interest are the earthquake exposure variables. So as I mentioned, we are focusing here on these strong and very strong earthquakes, and how we are going to get this information is by overlaying these polygons with the location of the clusters to see if the clusters, they were in the area that was affected by the earthquake. And we want to not only estimate the contemporaneous effect of the earthquakes, but also how the effects evolve over time. So we also include lags of this earthquake exposure. So in our model, we include many control variables. So we have social demographic characteristics that should not be affected by the earthquake itself, such as respondent age, the squared age, the age difference with the partner, education level, and the partner's education level. And in the estimations, we also include year fixed effects, district fixed effects, and state trends. So basically, we are here exploiting within variation, so the variation within districts, and trying to understand how the earthquakes affect violence. So coming to the results, here in columns 1 to 3, we have the effect of the very strong earthquakes that are above or equal to 7.0. And from columns 4 to 6, we have the strong earthquakes above 6.0. And what we see in each column, we are going to, so we start with the contemporaneous earthquake effect, and then we start including the lags. And what we find is that for the very strong earthquakes, there is a large and significant increase in violence in clusters that were affected by the earthquake at the same year of the interview. The effect is quite large. So being affected by an earthquake increases the probability that the respondent reports experiencing violence by 12.7 percentage points. So this is a very large effect. For the strong earthquakes, we do not detect a contemporaneous earthquake effect, but we see, in a sense, a delayed effect. So with a lag of 1 year, we see that there is an increase also in the incidence of violence. So just to sum up these first results, what we find is that there is this contemporaneous increase in IPV following very strong earthquakes, and a lag increase in IPV following the strong earthquakes. And this hints to the fact that vulnerability to IPV might be important not only in this emergency state that immediately follows the disaster, but also in the reconstruction period. So we conduct a series of robustness checks. So we also conduct an analysis at the aggregate level. So as I mentioned, we are going to rely on this information at the state level. And what we find, I will quickly show you, we also see an increase in the number of registered cases of violence against women, both for very strong and strong earthquakes. We have a different model specification. So we constructed exposure variable in different ways by varying the time spans, and also by conducting difference in difference with pure treatment and control groups. And we also conduct falsification tests. So what we are arguing is that the exposure to the earthquake is exogenous, but we can actually test this for this empirically. So we can see if the locations that in the future would be affected by an earthquake, if they already show higher levels of violence. And what this figure shows that we don't see pre-trends in this violence, but once the earthquake happens, we see that there is an increase that vanishes over time. So now in the last minutes, I would like to devote some time to discuss what could be potential explanations for this increase in IPV following the earthquakes. So we split this analysis in two parts. So first we look at heterogeneities that depend on initial characteristics that we test and are not affected by the earthquake itself. And then we look at channels that could be affected by the earthquake and are risk factors for violence. So for the heterogeneities, we are going to mainly rely on the existing papers on the literature. And we are going to focus on women's employment status, which is one important economic factor, the availability of protective institutions, and pre-existing household norms that are available in the DHS survey. And in terms of the channels that can explain male violent behavior, we focus on partners' alcohol consumption and male intra-household economic dominance. So we don't have information on the objective measure of whether the partner is employed or not, but we can see how they split these economic decisions within the household. So to sum up these results, what we find is that women employment status is an important heterogeneity factor, meaning that the effect of the earthquake is less pronounced for women that are employed at the time of the earthquake. And this is particularly true for the strong earthquakes. We see that the protective institutions also play a role, and in households that are located with protective institutions, the effect of the earthquake is smaller. And also, there are smaller effects for households that have, to start with, less strong norms, gender norms. In terms of the channels, what we find is that partners' alcoholic consumption increases following the earthquake, and this is the case both at the extensive and intensive margin. So particularly at the intensive margin, the partner's probability of getting the times that the partner gets drunk increase, and there is a marginal increase in the probability that the partner drinks. And we also find that there is a rise in male economic dominance following the earthquake, which affects this distribution of power in the household and could also explain this vulnerability of women to violence. So to sum up, in this paper, what we show is that exposure to a very large-scale natural disaster increases women's vulnerability to IPV. And this is the case not only in the emergency state immediately following the shock, but also in the reconstruction period. We try to disentangle what are the role of these internal and external risk factors. And we show that there are important roles for protective institutions, female economic status, and pre-existing gender norms. And we also find that partners' alcohol consumption and economic dominance are potential underlying channels. So if we think about, there are many different sources of natural disasters that are happening in many places. So the results in this paper, they might also shed some light on potential policies that might protect women in the aftermath of these disasters. So with that, I thank you all for the attention, and I would be happy to hear any comments or questions you might have.
Thanks, Laura. I think Carlos is the discussant here. Great. Go ahead, Carlos.
Okay, let me. Okay, I really enjoyed the paper, Laura. I mean, the topic is really important topic, and I think it's a nice paper. I don't want to use my time with the summary because I think you did a great job explaining what you do in the paper. Let me make some comments. I just wanted to share this lit review I had to do because I was working on COVID and crime, and we don't have other episodes like COVID, fortunately, in the past years, but the related literature is natural disaster and crime. So I think you do a great job in terms of framing the paper, Maybe you could mention other papers related to this literature, just for you, in case you wanted to compare your results with other studies. I think that you also do a great job in terms of the mechanism. You devote a special section for that. I really appreciate that when I was reading the paper. Also, you articulate your paper with COVID-19 and crime, and you mentioned two papers, one for Peru and the other for the US. And in these two papers, you also have results that are in line with your own result. But there are several other papers that you could also cite. I mentioned them here. There are a few that show that no result, and others show that that due to COVID, there was less domestic violence. This is a little bit surprising. For instance, in Uruguay, it's a hot topic, not only COVID and crime, but also specific COVID and domestic violence. So for you to know, in case you're interested, here is the potential paper that you could look at. Then I really like the empirical strategy. I think you have a really nice data set. I really like the survey that you used for Peru. Some comments. I think you explained very well the difference between the DHS data and the data from MIMP. But maybe you could think a little bit more about the difference between these two type of reports, because when you look at DHS, they ask, they ask women, have you ever experienced a situation where your partner pushed you? In the other case, you have episode where women go for help or they want to report. So maybe you have, in both cases, I think it's fine, because in both cases we have domestic violence, but maybe we have different levels of intensity, of different type of situation that, for instance, may you go for help, and in some cases you want, you are suffering violence, you should go for help, but maybe women don't do that. So maybe you can address potential differences there, but I think it's good to have these two sources. A question related to empirical strategy too is if the DHS is representative at the cluster level. It's not clear in the paper, and that could be important when you deal with referees. I'm not sure if you're in that situation, but it could show up, that question. One thing that is also true is that, of course, earthquakes are exogenous, but your main assumption is not just earthquake are exogenous, but you need exogeneity in the way your data is collected. Because remember that you have a survey, and it's not that you can observe that. You cannot observe that. You can trust your survey. I think that the good thing that you have is the other data source. But for instance, what happens if, I don't know, the guys that are collecting the data, conducting the surveys, they need to go to different specific areas due to the natural disaster, and that could eventually, I don't think so, but just to think about it, eventually could affect the results. So maybe addressing that in the main assumption could help. I don't think you should do anything else. And just to finish, I really appreciate when you notice the potential sorting problems, which are there, and when we do something that is spatial, they are always there. I like that. Falsification tests are really appropriate. Maybe you need to discuss that or anticipate that when you present the discussion between intensive and extensive margin. One thing related to the previous session, that I think you were there, one of the paper will use an event study, difference in difference. Why don't you try to do something like that if possible? That would be very nice. And one question to me is related to the first point here, first bullet, why you have a stronger effect at the aggregate level. And that's it. Sorry if I use more than my 5 minutes, but I really like the paper. Congratulations, Laura.
Great, thanks, Carlos. Yes, we don't have time for questions right now, but after my presentation, of course, we'll have longer time for further discussion. So let me get my screen up and the timers set. Okay, great. You can see the PowerPoint? Great, thanks. Okay. All right, so I'm happy to present this work that I've done with Lisa Perova from the World Bank and Ian Schmutte from the University of Georgia. Lisa helped us get funding from the World Bank. The Latin America Gender Innovation Lab helped fund the research assistant for this study. So we're looking at the gender wage gap in Brazil and if that influences intimate partner violence, examining administrative health data. So probably a lot of you are familiar with gender violence in Brazil and Latin America. Of course, there's a history of machismo. More recently, the World Health Organization study found that 1/3 of women has experienced intimate partner violence throughout their lives. This has improved people's attitudes toward intimate partner violence, especially with the passing of the Maria da Penha law in 2006, which provided more harsh punishments for abusers. So more recently, 91% say that husbands who beat their wives belong in jail. But still, we have some people, 82%, partially agreeing that outsiders should not get involved in marital disputes. So that's a little bit problematic that people are still not willing to stop the violence at a public scale instead of considering it a private scale. So here's a graph of female homicides in Brazil. It's quite high. In 2013, it was the highest, or fifth highest in the world. You can see that in 2007, we had this little dip right after the Maria da Penha law happened. People were taking intimate partner violence much more seriously, but that unfortunately, in at least the aggregate, was short-lived. And once again, the homicide rate continued to rise. I think it's been fairly steady since 2013, though. So why do we think the gender wage ratio might influence intimate partner violence? This is based on the theory that women's economic empowerment can influence their relationships. They can leave abusive husbands if they have more money, or their husbands will realize that the possibility of leaving is a credible threat, so the husbands may treat them better. So there's a little literature and the conditional cash transfer research that shows that in Mexico and Peru, conditional cash transfers are associated with the reduction in intimate partner violence. But for Brazil itself, with the Bolsa Familia, my co-authors and I didn't find any change in homicides relating to CCTs, which perhaps is not too surprising because it's not that much money and homicides are a very extreme outcome. But we did find an increase in separations of partners with children. There's also literature on natural fluctuations of the economic status of women. We have, in Asia, female employment is associated with increases in IPV, suggesting that backlash is a possible mechanism. Men are concerned about women's empowerment and react with violence, or there may be more conflict over how to spend this additional money that arrives in the household. On the other hand, in England, Anderberg et al. Find that female employment is associated with less IPV, and we can postulate that the difference here is the institutions available in England in contrast to Asia, as Laura was mentioning in Peru. And then we have two papers that are the most similar to what we're going to be doing, examining if the gender wage gap is associated with female hospitalizations. This is found to reduce emergency room visits in California and in Uruguay. So we model our paper after Iser's paper on California. We have some strengths relative to hers. Her study was only on low-income women in California, so that's a smaller portion of the population that we're able to look at in Brazil. We do limit our study to urban, larger urban centers because of the magnitude of the outcomes. For some of the outcomes like homicide, they're very small, so that doesn't appear in rural centers, but we still are able to cover 70% of the population. And then we're able to look at 3 levels of violence, not just one. So we have data from the National Death Registry on homicides, and then there's the information from the health ministry, recording all the incidents of overnight hospitalizations, and all of these are coded for the cause of the hospitalization. So we pull out those for regression. And finally, there's a really exciting new resource, a registry on violence that health workers report. So this was established to be mandatory at a federal level in 2011. And so they, in this registry, the medical providers, which could be anything from a dentist to an emergency room doctor, they file a report if their patient reveals that they have been a victim of gender-based violence, or if the provider suspects that the patient has been a victim of gender-based violence. So because this was a new procedure, we only use the entities that had been reporting in 2011. We didn't want to have the measurements be tarnished by this new law. So we wanted the organizations to already have this procedure in practice and not have a scaling up measurement. And we also check that the informal sector wages are similar to the formal sector. We're able to use data on all formal sector wages in Brazil's Ministry of Labor database, but because Brazil's informal sector is large, we do make that comparison using the PNAD data, and we find that the informal sector is slightly more gender equitable than the formal sector, so we don't think that should be biasing our results in a negative way. Of course, there are a few disadvantages to our approach relative to Iser. We aren't able to disaggregate based on education and race. There are some concerns with the health worker reporting. It can be very based on the health worker's perception, and not all health workers are going to want to take the time to fill out these reports. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a low incidence of some of these low frequency events, such as overnight hospitalizations and homicides. And finally, our data doesn't cover quite as many years as Iser has. So what is the formal labor force like in Brazil? Like most Latin American countries, Brazil are more educated than men on average. Even so, the gender wage ratio is only 0.86 in favor of men. And as I mentioned before, we checked that the informal sector is slightly better, but the women are slightly more likely to be in the informal sector than men. For our time period that we're studying, 2011 to 2016, there was a recession, and that allowed for some variation in the gender wage gap across the municipalities and time, as we see that the ratio of participation for women increased from 68 to 71%. So there's a concern with the labor force data using just the raw gender wage gap, because that could have a demand side endogeneity issue. So we want to only look, oh, sorry, a supply side, supply of labor, endogeneity issue. So we only want to look at how the wages changing might influence the gender wage gap. So we keep the industry, the composition of the industry fixed from the baseline, and then allow the wages to fluctuate for that baseline composition based on the changes in wages in all the other municipalities. Sorry, the timer. So the wages elsewhere are changing, and that generates the demand for labor for that specific municipality, but we don't use the actual wage within the municipality itself. So this is a kind of a Bartik style wage measure. So here you can see changes over time for all of Brazil with the municipalities. Blue means the gender wage gap improved, and red means it worsened for women. Here on the right is the analytical sample we use, so we don't use very many municipalities, but we still have a nice variation, and these municipalities do cover 70% of the Brazilian population of women. Here are some summary statistics. You can get an idea for the magnitude. So homicides, it's a little bit higher than the national average because this is limited to the women ages 15 to 19, and or not 19, 15 to 49, and they're more likely to be victims. So it's slightly higher. And then the hospitalizations is about twice as high as that, especially in the analytical sample. The excluded sample is more rural, so we don't see as many hospitals there. So I think that's why that's lower in the excluded portion. And then you can see the reports from the medical providers. That's a lot higher. So that is where we're getting a lot of our variation, and it's an exciting new outcome measure to measure violence against women. So here's our first results. We use the raw wage ratio just to see what these correlations would look like. You can see over on the reports, we have statistically significant correlations. However, once we take into account the more exogenous measure, using the municipalities' wages left out, we see still all negative reductions, but these lose magnitude, and the significance and magnitude jumps up over here for homicides. So this would be from a change of the wage ratio going from 0 to 1, leaves us with a 1.6 drop in percentage point, not percent, sorry, 1.6 percentage drop in homicides. Of course, we're already at 0.86, so we aren't going to see a change in the gender wage gap of 1. So if we imagine instead a 10% change in the gender wage gap, that is, 0.16%. And that more or less corresponds to 1 woman's life out of 500 being saved from a 10% increase in the gender wage gap. Next, we do a few heterogeneity explorations. When we look at poverty as determined by the Human Development Index, we see that the drop in homicides is concentrated amongst those where they're poorer and not doing as well as the HDI. So that's good for 2 reasons, because it's the poorer communities, and that's also where they have higher rates of homicide in the first place. Then, like Laura did, we separated out the municipalities where there is no women's police station from those where there is a women's police station. And a lot of these women's police stations were established after the Maria da Penha law. And here, this is super interesting. We see that where there's the police station that support, we have a drop in the reports. The least severe measurement we have But also in the reports, we see an increase in these municipalities where there is no women's police station. So that suggests when women are earning more, if they don't have that institutional support, it's possible that the backlash mechanism is happening, at least on this very, this lower level of violence measurement. And finally, we did a heterogeneity for the ages. We recalculated the wage ratio just for the specific age groups of 15 to 29, and again for 30 to 49. And here we see that impacts of increasing the gender wage gap for women are most pertinent for the younger women, and we don't see much going on for the older women. So in summary, we see that overall, for all of Brazil, the homicides were reduced, and that was concentrated among poorer cities. But when we did these other heterogeneity analyses, we saw some impacts among lesser forms of violence from the gender wage gap, in particular for the women's police station and amongst these younger women. But when there was no women's police station, there was an increase in the reports by the health providers. So in conclusion, women's economic empowerment can reduce intimate partner violence at different levels of severity. We saw something happen for each of our various outcomes. However, it's not across the board where it's all happening, so context matters. And these impacts are rather small, so non-market interventions are needed. Market forces alone will not likely resolve the violence against women in Brazil. So we need more interventions, and interventions that will address each of these levels of severity. So muito obrigada. Laura will now discuss.
All right. So first of all, I really enjoyed reading your paper, Sarah. I think it was very interesting, and you motivate very well the importance of this topic. I think one of the major contributions of the paper is really to look at these different measures of violence by distinguishing these different levels. So I thought it was really important, and also in terms of these policy implications. And I would have, mainly comments and questions. So first, I was wondering a bit about the symmetry of the effects, because your wage ratio, it could be affected either by a change in the women's wages or male wages. And then I was wondering if you would expect, in a sense, different effects. So it could be the case that you have differential effects, especially this backlash. It could be the case that it changes depending on whether if it's the male who is losing or the female. Then my second comment is also related a bit about this effect. So I was wondering if you also expect non-linear effects. So in a sense, I would think that depending on the level of wage disparity, the responses could be different. So especially if we think about very extreme cases in which you have a lot of inequality, maybe there are not such strong responses. Whereas if you have more competition, in a sense, if you have more equality in a sense, the responses could be larger once one of the parties is losing. And lastly, I was thinking about this differentiation between labor force participation and the gender wage gap. So in a sense, did you think about also measuring this gap in terms of labor force participation? Because in the introduction, you also mentioned that there was some change in the gap in labor force participation, and I was wondering that maybe the effects could be even larger. So in terms of the wages, it could be more marginal effect, and then if you think about unemployment, the effect would be even stronger. So I thought it could be something to look at also. And then I have some minor points. So the first one is about the age of the women in the sample. So right now you motivate really well why you focus on women aged 15 to 49, because of this is the age group that is looked in the violence literature. But officially in the Brazilian labor market, I think women can, or people can only be employed after 16 or even 18. So I was wondering if from the perspective of the labor market, it would make sense to change a bit the age group. So by having it 16 until 49 or 18, 49, but this is, I don't think it would change much because it's only a small part of the sample, but I was just thinking about this. Then I have just one comment. I think there is a paper, a working paper that can be very complementary to your paper by Balotra and co-authors, which is about job displacement, unemployment benefits, and domestic violence. So it's different in the sense that they are looking at the individual level. And then I think it's quite interesting to relate to your findings, which are also at the aggregate level. So I think they complement each other in a very nice way. Then a very small point is about, so at some point you also discussed about the measurement of educational attainment using data from the electoral court. And I was just thinking, I'm not so sure if the data on education is actually updated over time. So I think it's the education at the time that the individuals get registered. And then in a sense, I think this is fine for lower levels of education, but I believe it doesn't capture very well the higher education levels because I think it's not updated. And finally, I was wondering if you also thought about controlling for the share of cohabiting or married individuals, because the probability, I would think that maybe this doesn't vary so much, but maybe it's something that would also predict violence in a sense because you have more couples together. So I thought maybe using this as a control could be also important. But I really enjoy reading the paper and I hope the comments are helpful.
Thanks, Laura. I think these are great suggestions, especially the one about the symmetry. That would be really interesting to see. I think, yeah, the labor force participation idea is great. In a way, we were thinking of looking at the wage gap, not participation, because even if someone's not working, if they still have the possibility of getting a job with a reasonable wage, it could still influence their outcomes within the household. But it does seem like this could be testable to see if there's an impact at a larger scale for employment or non-employment. And thanks so much for the reference. I'll definitely check that out. That sounds fantastic. Great. So I think we'll open it up now to broader discussion. So if anybody has questions for anybody's specific paper or the group in general to discuss.
Could I talk? Okay.
Great.
I have one question to Laura. Laura, just a clarifying question. How many treated clusters do you have? I mean, in how many regions do you observe earthquakes?
So I don't have the summary statistics right now, but the incidence is very low. So it's less than 1% of the clusters are affected by the earthquake, especially if we consider the full sample with the 2000s wave, in which, so the 2000s wave was a full DHS. So there are a lot of, like a large share of the sample comes from the 2000 DHS. If we don't consider the 2000 DHS, which could be affected by the earthquakes, I would say it's a bit bigger, but it's quite a small share of clusters that are affected indeed. And we also didn't know exactly how to deal with the fact that we have this small incidence. So would you have any recommendation on how to deal with that, or?
I really don't know. As you are exploring a really exogenous event, I really trust on your identification strategy, but I don't know. I think you could try to check what the recent papers are doing, right? Maybe synthetic control, but I don't know if it's necessary as you are exploring a really exogenous event, you know? But maybe a synthetic control method.
Thank you. I also think that maybe with the state, because we also have this variation, like we also consider the exposure at the state level, and then it's much bigger because the states are a much larger area and we are only considering any overlap. So I think maybe this state analysis help us to make it a bit more, make it a case that, but yeah, this is something we need to discuss and think about.
I think you could discuss a little bit more. And also, I couldn't understand during your presentation, but it was a really short presentation. That's why I think I couldn't understand. I could understand the differentiation between clusters, regions, you know, these spatial definitions, I could understand, but it was a super fast presentation. That's why I think it was not clear, right? I'm quite sure in the paper it's okay.
Thank you. No, I think it's something that we could also present a bit better, like with the maps showing the districts and the clusters and so on. Maybe overlaying with the administrative regions would be, but yeah, nice to hear that it's something we need to address. Thank you.
Sarah, can I ask you a question too? Are you exploring the disaggregated, are you exploring the data at the individual level, or are you, no?
No, we don't have the identification. There's one paper that they have within the Ministry of Health, that because they have access to the IDs that look at, I think it's the mortality data and see if it's associated with the health reports, to see if people who are reported end up more, unfortunately, murdered at a higher frequency. And there they're able to do it with the IDs, but we don't have that data. And the health data is not identified with the Brazilian national ID. It's some specific health ID.
Yeah, they are not identified. You can obtain identified data if you sign a cooperation agreement with the Minister of Health. But if you don't have an agreement with them, you can obtain a data without identification, but
we have that.
Oh, you have that.
Yes, we have that. But to do the analysis, we had to aggregate up to the municipal level.
Yeah, but the point was, sorry. But I think, at least in my paper, it was super nice when we started to investigate the homicides that occurred as a consequence of an aggression that occurred within the household. Exploring the disaggregated data, you can focus on this kind of homicides. I don't know if you focus because it clean a lot the data. Okay, you exclude a lot of measurement error. You know.
Right. I think we looked at the summary statistics about like where the homicide occurred.
Oh, great.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm not. We didn't use that as an outcome specifically for homicides.
Yeah. We can discuss more about the data if you want. I know you know a lot of data. If you want,
no, I love the data. I'm happy to discuss it further. It's amazing data. So we do still have a lot more time because there wasn't a fourth presentation. So I don't know if we can pull together kind of a more broader discussion about where this field should move forward, given what we just discussed. Maybe perhaps the first question could be, what data do we need to push these questions further? If anyone wants to answer from the panel, or other people who are working on different papers that have their own thoughts. Thanks, Jocelyn. I think these outcomes are so interesting because they're like, they have shame involved with the intimate partner violence and such, and then likewise with the youth crime, nobody wants to admit to this. So there's a lot of reporting issues that are a challenge.
I think our main challenge is exactly this one, Sarah told us, the reporting bias, right? Our main challenge. Everybody discussed about it, right?
Yes.
Maybe in addition to reporting, I think the whole understanding of the violence itself, right? Because sometimes it's so deeply rooted that women, as Sarah mentioned in her presentation, there is a lot of, in a sense, acceptance of violence. So if we need first to understand also how serious and how not normal the situations are, and then I think reporting is also a second big issue.
Perfect.
Yeah, and this is kind of related to Carlos's paper, like when do people become aware of things that they're doing are not okay? No.
Exactly, I agree. I mean, I think that when we talk, especially related to crime in general, but in particular domestic violence, I've been working closely with people in the police here in Uruguay to try to understand this problem, and reporting is crucial. I mean, we have these things that are like accepted and are okay. So something that I try to comment to Laura, that maybe we have something that is violence, but we are not reporting that. And we need to capture that. Something that I really like from the survey is that it captures any source, any type of violence. We have a big debate here in the last, well, COVID is like the main topic everywhere. But when COVID started in Montevideo, specifically in Uruguay, the government, as in many countries, suggests a hotline for a woman to call in case of domestic violence. And the debate was that the government reported a decrease in domestic violence, but at the same time, the number of phone calls rise 80%. And part of the discussion was how we contemplate both statistics, both results. Okay, there's different theories. Maybe we are measuring something different related to what we report and what we don't. But I think that reporting in crime in general, but in particular domestic violence, is a really important topic.
Luciani and Laura, I'm just wondering from your participation in the GeFam network, like how the GeFam is thinking about these topics and planning for the future.
Luciani is unmuted. Actually, Sarah, we are a young research group, right? But we are producing a lot of research, and we try to work independently, and at the same time we talk and we discuss a lot. We have weekly webinars, and then we try to produce together, okay, to write with the other members of the group. But I don't know exactly how to answer your question, you know. Yeah, but our activities are like that. We have a lot of activities. I think this is the most productive group. I'm certain, you know, we discuss a lot, we talk a lot. Yeah, I think a nice, it's good to be at GeFam, within, I don't know, in GeFam, because GeFam connect people, you know, they try to connect people all the time, right?
Yes.
Even people that are not in GeFam, you know, I think it's a really good point. Yeah. I don't know, Luciana would like to talk a little bit.
I'm gonna try to complement Laura. So yes, we are like a new group. We have a lot of discussion between us. We have study groups that we meet mostly weekly. And we try to like construct agendas within different subgroups between us. so we can work in different papers. So yeah, basically we are trying to grow, to be a number and in activities, and I think we are in a good way right now. This is our second meeting. We received a lot of papers and interesting papers. So I think we are in a good way, a good path, I would say.
Great, yeah, it's been a wonderful conference.
And thank you all for the good papers and the presentation. They are very, very good. In the comments as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you have any other comments or questions from the audience? Any papers you want to tell us about that you're working on that you'd like to connect here with people and get a little marketing?
About me right now, me and Solange from GeFam, we are starting a new project to work with credit data from the central bank, and how female and young female, how the credit can affect labor participation. So we are in a new, like, very, very preliminary work. But regarding GeFam, right now, talking about me, I'm connecting with Solange to try to work this paper.
Sounds exciting.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
So I think we could end the session, right?
All right. Yes.
Pleasure.
No, good. Indeed.
It was a pleasure to meet with you all. It was, I mean, the presentations were very, very, very good, and the work as well. So thank you.
Thank you for organizing and having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great. We'll see you soon.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.